For good reason, we highlight the extraordinary work of journalists in an attempt to light the path for others to follow. What we often don't do very well or at all is discuss what we can learn from the moments our industry would rather forget. Jayson Blair's name has become synonymous with one of those extraordinary episodes you're probably all familiar with. Just more than 20 years ago, Jayson, then a young reporter at the New York Times, was at the center of a plagiarism scandal that prompted a wholesale shakeup of the Times masthead and rocked the larger journalism industry. The case remains a cautionary tale more than that for young journalists and their capacity to meet high expectations and the obligations of an industry to ensure proper oversight and that standards are never compromised. Jayson is now the managing partner of Goose Creek Consulting, a firm that specializes in leadership development, career, and mental health coaching. I thought it was especially relevant to have Jayson here today in light of what our industry is going through. And I think he will address some of that in his remarks to you today. But please welcome Jayson Blair.
It's nice to meet you guys. Let me see, am I on? You can hear me okay? Everybody, okay. So it's really nice to be here. And I genuinely mean that. It's not a fun topic to talk about, but it's nice to be here because, I think we're at a point sort of in our history as a country where, and maybe the world, where we need good journalism more today than probably any other recent period. You have to go back to like the 1880s or even before then, the founding of the country, to imagine a time where we need it more. And I was listening to a podcast this morning and David Ignatius of the Washington Post was on. And one of the things, and I've been thinking about like, am I optimistic or am I pessimistic about journalism? One thing he said was, he was talking about Kristi Noem. He's like, people lie with impunity right now. So there will be plenty of work for journalists sorting out things. And it's so, as somebody who is on the outside right now and is not a journalist, it's so important to the rest of us that there are people who are dedicating themselves to sorting out what's happening. I generally try not to discuss this time period. I tend to make two exceptions. I will talk to a classroom of graduate students or undergraduate students at any point to talk about how they can learn lessons from my experience to not make similar mistakes. And I care about this for a couple reasons. One, I think journalism is a noble, important, powerful profession. There are few professions that I think are as important to society. I'm a believer in democracy, few that are as important to democracy. You can go and you can look at the North Korean Constitution if you've ever read it. It promises absolute freedom of the press, absolute freedom of the press. It's not the way it plays out. And we're lucky to be in a place where when it comes to freedom of the press, we are more, not perfectly, but more aligned with the values that we state. And I would say the second reason I think that comes into that is I think people have blind spots. I have a friend who's an FBI profiler who likes to tell me that anyone is capable of anything. We just believe we're not. And I think that's very true of me. When I was at the Times, I was probably the loudest critic of people like Patricia Smith or Janet Cook. I could not fathom how someone would do something like that. And I think it truly created a blind spot for me as I headed down the slippery slope. And then I'll make the second reason, then I'll come back to that. Second reason I'll do it is mental health. One of the things that I love talking about mental health because I think it's something that I can really offer just based on my experience in terms of helping people. And over the years, one of the things that I've noticed when I've been going to classes with journalism students, there's certainly an openness to talking about mental health, but what I'm seeing is more mental health struggles. And often those struggles are related to their classwork, but they're often related to their internships and they're related to the work they're doing for their student publications. So that's another reason. But going back to the point of sort of like a slippery slope, I don't know have any of you guys seen the movie The Paper? It's a Michael Keaton movie. Robert Duvall's in it. It's great. You should all go watch it if you haven't. Yeah. So Michael Keaton is the city editor of I think it's called the New York Sun. And I think it's like modeled after the New York Post. Glenn Close is the managing editor. And yeah, Keaton's the city editor, and then Robert Duvall, I think he's the executive editor. And there's this moment in there where Duvall and Keaton are at the bar talking. And Duvall says to Keaton, if a guy came into your house with a gun and he told you, I'm going to shoot your wife if you don't stop working more hours at the Sun, what would you do? And Keaton, as you can believe, said, well, I'd quit working at the Sun, right? And what Duvall says is the problem with decisions like this is that they never come in one big moment. It's always 1 hour at a time, 2 hours at a time, staying a little later. Now, he was talking about domestic relations, and his point was like, all of a sudden, you're all alone because you have left, in that example, your family. And I think that's very true about ethical mistakes. It's never somebody sends you a memo like, hey, do you want to plagiarize or fabricate? That's not the way it's presented to you. It's presented in little moments where you make little compromises, right? And it was a time for us, and this is not to excuse it at all, because I really do believe I'm responsible for what I did. I certainly had mental health issues going on that made it a bit of a perfect storm, but I really think it comes down to like character played, and lack of integrity played a huge role in it for me. But, you know, we were under an enormous amount of stress. We were coming off 9/11. We were walking into the Iraq War. There was a lot of trauma in the newsroom that we weren't addressing. You know, it led to some poor decisions. It was the beginning of the age of really the online newspaper moving from just something that was a replica of the day's newspaper to where we were putting really real reporting into it. So there was that new pressure, one that you all feel intensely, right? And so all these things were coming together, and Hal Raines had become our executive editor. Part of his philosophy was this notion of flood the zone. And I'll never forget an editor who I will not name saying, you know, there was a reporter working on a story and she was like, I'm not so sure about this fact. And he said something that you would never hear at the Times before this point, which was like, we can get it wrong today and we'll just come back and fix it in the morning. And I just thought to myself, he was talking about the follow-up story. I thought to myself, wow, that is so different than our normal approach. And so in thinking about those kinds of pressures and thinking about what to say today, I really thought about the idea that it was really a beginning of the age that you guys are dealing with times 10. And one difference that we didn't have to face, that you do have to face, is you're doing it with much fewer resources. You know, you're in a contracting industry. You're in an industry that doesn't devote the same resources to editing. You are under a pressure, you know, like when we were there, let's say the Supreme Court made a ruling in the beginning of the sort of online age, 8 hours for the story, right? 6 hours for the story. Now the expectation is that in a place like the Times or Washington Post, you're gonna have something in 10 minutes. And so without that extra support, I think it's a enormous challenge. And I think about the reaction to my scandal, to what I did. One of the reactions to that was to add ombudsman. Are you guys familiar with an ombudsman? Right? So somebody who is an internal public editor, takes complaints from readers, takes complaints internally that aren't handled particularly well, provides their own independent opinion. You know, they're often on one-year contracts that can be renewed, can't be fired during that time, and have dedicated space to share the issues. And I think that was a really smart move, because if you look at my story, one of the things that you can see is there were a lot of canaries in the coal mine. There were people at the Washington Post who were like, what is going on here? I don't really believe this. There were people at the Times who were like, why is he here when he should be there? So there are all these people who had these little clues. And part of what was happening in our newsroom, which comes back to like this idea of having a functional newsroom is really important. When Howell came in, his philosophy really alienated a number of editors in our newsroom, including the people who were my editors. So my editors began to see concerns about my reporting, about my well-being, and my health. But they didn't feel like, or at least they've said they didn't feel like they could go to the senior leaders because of their relationships with them, which is like definitely the argument for like functional newsrooms and having an external force that people can go to. They also, another reaction was to bring in a standards editor. Somebody who is really responsible for what are the standards, kind of like you see on TV, what are the standards for getting something published in here? What are we gonna hold things up to? And another reaction was to bulk up the copy desk. So those were the copy editors who after, we wrote things, we had something called backfill editors, like content editors essentially, who were editing for the content, for the thought. We had a robust desk of copy editors, and that was increased and expanded. And I was thinking about this in 2017, the Times got rid of its ombudsman. At the end of 2017, they got rid of all their freestanding copy desks. It reminds me, those who do not remember history are doomed to repeat it, right? And we're going through a very similar phase of making mistakes right now. Now, we haven't had the giant Jayson Blair as of late, but I have a feeling it's around the corner. So part of what I wanted to at least talk to you guys about is how do you function in this environment where you have the same expectations we did and less support. And so how do you manage the stress? How do you handle the stress? Because one of the really interesting things about the major plagiarists and people who have fabricated, we haven't gotten really good answers from a lot of them about why. But I see some sort of parallels in the people who have talked about it, like me and Stephen Glass. Anxiety, pressure, pride, right? Hubris, believing that you would never fall into that trap, doing a great job of lying to yourself once you did fall into the trap. Anxiety. I think anxiety for a lot of people is a big thing, and I think a lot of you guys are dealing with that in the work. I'm shocked that any of your publications give you like once a month on a Friday to come do this. I'm totally shocked. I don't know what you guys had to do, but it's pretty impressive that it's happening. So for me, I am optimistic about journalism. I really do think that there is amazing work being done out there, but I'm really worried about journalists, and I'm really worried about the welfare and the well-being. And if we get to a point where you all falter, I think you all probably know this, that democracy is really in trouble. Like civil society is really in trouble. And taking it back to mine, part of the reason why, I was just talking to Kevin about this outside, my initial reaction to being caught, I think was anger, oddly. Anger and frustration and feeling like a victim. My next phase of my reaction was absolute contrition. But I don't think I really knew at that point what I was contrite for. I just knew that I was looking at a bunch of people I really loved and cared about, and a profession I cared about, and whatever I had done, all of what I had done some damage. And I think over time, I feel like there was this moment during the Trump campaign where a lot crystallized to me. Donald Trump put out this tweet where he was attacking the New York Times and he was using my name. One of the things that I think I feel more contrite for, or most contrite for, is making it harder for journalists to be able to do their jobs. So I think another thing I'm really contrite for, right, is disappointing the people who cared about me. despite some of the stories that are out there, the people at the Times were so unbelievably loving. They knew that there was plagiarism and fabrication in my last week of work, and all they cared about was my welfare and well-being. The part of the story that doesn't get reported is when I decided to resign and disappear, they didn't empty the newsroom to go find my plagiarism and fabrication. They emptied the newsroom to come find me, and they did find me, and they got me help. They extended my insurance. So I have nothing but gratitude for them. And so I'm sad I hurt the institution, but I'm also sad that I hurt the individual people, and I made their work harder because of my actions. I am grateful, or was grateful, for some of the reforms, some of the resources that went into the profession after that, but I've become increasingly alarmed by the direction that we're headed in. And so I have this risk, because I love to hear myself talk, of sucking all the oxygen out of the room, because I could keep on going. But I do want to turn it over to you guys so I can answer any questions that you have about my situation, about my current thoughts on things. I spend a lot of time thinking about things like disinformation, misinformation, as you can imagine why, right? I spend a lot of time thinking about how people slip into these traps. I'm like a lot of you guys, at least I hope a lot of you guys, in the sense that I got into journalism for very noble reasons. I felt it had the power to help people. I felt it had the power to heal people. And I think this one is underrated, but as corny as it sounds, to entertain people and transport them out of their painful spots. I feel like I've forfeited my opportunity to do good in the world, but I still have an opportunity to help you guys do it. So with that, I will stop, and okay to take questions.
I'd like to start with one. You mentioned the many incremental decisions that are made over time that result in what happened to you. Can you talk about sort of what maybe the first of those incremental decisions and how you justified that going forward?
And I have another colleague who never, and there are parallels between our situations. It never became a public thing with this colleague. But I would say for me, coming out of 9/11, and this is actually a good point that I didn't make, you guys deal with, and I know as Washington reporters, it's easy to tell yourselves you don't deal with trauma, but you're covering all sorts of horrible things, like Ukraine, like Gaza, like, I don't know, January 6th. So I think post 9/11, we didn't have time to focus on our well-being, or at least we didn't take time to focus on our well-being. We did have time. And so coming out of 9/11, I started feeling for the first time in my life a lot of anxiety. And that anxiety was manifesting itself in all sorts of weird ways. You guys can tell I'm a talker probably by now. I love to talk. I say I love to talk to people, but I'm pretty sure it's to talk at people. I joke I'm an introvert, and people say, how do you talk in front of people? I'm like, it's just simple. If I hide, you can't talk to me. And if I keep talking, you can't talk to me. But so I was feeling a lot of anxiety, struggling to do things like man on the street interviews and other things along those lines. And then the first time I really remember, and this was a non-violent brief, but I had been sent out to do man on the street interviews. It was related to something to do with 9/11. And I came back and I just could not do the interviews. Something in me, like my mouth was not opening. So I pulled a quote from the Associated Press, which you would normally then say, according to the Associated Press, or Joe said the Associated Press, and then I left off the Associated Press part of it. And about 7 o'clock at night, I'll never forget this, in our little insurance sales people newsroom, I had a panic at my desk that I need to go run over to the copy desk and tell them to add the attribution. and I didn't. And I went home because I think I was like afraid. I don't know why. But, and I didn't. And I went home and I was convinced that was it. They were going to catch that. Tomorrow morning, I'm going to be hot water and eventually I'm going to get fired. And then it didn't happen. And that, I think, on a subconscious and conscious level, sent the message to me that, oh, wait, our protections are not as good as they are. So as I became less unwell, this became an avenue, because a lot of people like wondered why I did it. Like there was no like fame, front page, glory thing for me. I just wanted to be able to, an important part of my story is I had gone to rehab the year before. The Times had given me a ton of time off to go to rehab. So I felt like I didn't have a second chance. So what I was trying to do as I was becoming increasingly unwell was not reach out to help again, because for some reason in my mind, there's no such thing as a second chance, at least at that point. Not to reach out for help again. I had pride. I thought I could fix it on my own. So my plagiarism and fabrication is really about trying to do my job without being able to really do my job, without being able to travel, without being able to function. Because you'll see these bumps. Like if you really study the articles, some professors, I think at the University of Texas or it was the University of North Carolina, there are two different studies on them. Kind of like notice there are these waves of like perfectly fine stories and perfectly jacked up stories. And I think a lot of that had to do with my ability to function. But in my head, there was now this tool or this way, and it just got worse and worse over time. Does that make sense? That's what I talk about. It was like a slippery slope, and then
I'm Aneri with KFF Health News. I wanted to ask you, a lot of the sort of fixes you spoke about were systematic things, like the copy desk, the ombudsman standards, great things, but we're seeing them diminish. And also, like, for most of us in this newsroom, we're not at a place where we can enact those things.
Correct. Right.
So at an individual level, I guess, what are your tips or ideas or suggestions for how we kind of avoid falling into something like this?
Yeah. So there are a couple different things. I think journalists, by and large, I've never really looked at the psychological profile of journalists. I might go do this when I get home. But I think tend to be relatively ambitious, but also very eager to please. It's a weird combo, right? So I think what journalists often struggle with is having boundaries, particularly with their editors. So like and you get this, right? Like I used to call it, there's like an 8-ball story and we're up for 72 hours straight. All we're drinking is coffee. Like that kind of thing is inevitably going to happen, right? Like wars and other things like that. But I think it has this tendency of making us boundaryless, not taking time off, not having good, always being willing to answer the call. And I think focusing on boundaries is one important thing, wherever that is for you, because there's no magic formula. Like we're all very different in terms of what we need. I think the other thing is, I used to say that the newspaper is not going to hug you at night. Good relationships with whoever provides the support in your life, being able to get feedback, like listening to that voice where they say, what you're doing is crazy. And you're like, oh, in my head, they just don't understand journalism. Pause and listen to what they're saying. And then I would say taking care of our mental health is an important piece of it. I think people tend to ignore that stuff. They tend to not carve out space for it. Particularly, I think in general, everyone should, because we all have mental health, even if you don't have mental health disorders. But in high pressure fields, I think you should pay extra attention to it. And the other thing, going back to what I was saying before, looking for the small compromises that you make. Like, it's impossible to get this story in on the deadline, so I'm going to cut some kind of corner, is way worse than just saying, hey, boss, it's impossible to get the story on. Now, you may suffer consequences for it, but you probably want to suffer those consequences as opposed to the me consequences, if that makes sense. Did that answer your question even? I don't know. I get started and I have no idea what the hell I'm talking about.
Hi, I'm Jacob. I'm a freelancer.
Hey, Jacob.
Thank you so much for speaking with us and for your candor and all of that. I wanted to pick up on something you mentioned initially, which is the economic contraction that's happening in the industry and sort of how the rest of us are feeling that. And I'm curious about your perspective when we're thinking about setting those boundaries, prioritizing our mental health, being real people, sort of, I don't want to speak for anybody else, but at least for me, the power imbalance that sometimes we have versus the people that are in charge, particularly in an industry where we are always replaceable. These are coveted jobs. There are very few jobs that cover Washington, and we are so lucky to have them. And we are, at-will employees and can be dropped at any moment in the drop of a hat. So given that, how do you then say, no, I need more money, or I need a day off for my mental health or whatever, when the response can be, okay, I'll find someone else?
Well, I mean, like, taking care of yourself always comes with a price, right? And that's ultimately the piece of it. The hard part, I think, is, well, so I think for some people, the hard part is even doing it, even saying, like, I need help, right? Whether that's pride or you want to be really dutiful. Like, I think if you can get past that, like, initial, because you guys are supposed to be superheroes, let's honestly. You're supposed to be superheroes. That's the whole thing. You're supposed to be able to do anything. So if you can get past that sort of like pride or worry about even asking, I think the tough part is knowing where the line is for you. And this is not really answering your question, but this is one thing I've noticed in other professions or among some journalists. Having that trusted colleague or someone around you can be like, dude, you are not okay. No, you shouldn't be able to do this. So that's the warning piece of it. But figuring out what the limits are for you, what the needs are for you, being willing to adjust them in the time, and then being willing to pay some kind of price. Because I don't think the first price you pay is like, you don't have your job, right? I think the first price you pay is like, you might not get the call or you might not get the best assignment. So I think the way to do it, really probably the best way with most editors, is to not just say, I know I characterize it as being like boundaries and no, but like to compromise with them. To say, look, I'm going to do this for you right now, for example, but I'm going to need this. Or whatever the compromise is that you feel like they're to get the right balance. And if you're not getting that compromise, even if you're at a great publication like some of these that I see right here, you got to ask yourself, is it worth it? Like, are you really going to be serving, whatever the reason is you got into journalism, if you start to fall apart? Or are you only going to be serving it for a temporary period? And if you're good with that, and good with burning out, I guess that's okay. But so I think that's the way I would approach it. Because it's not one of those things, you're not in a profession where you're going to be able to just draw down the line. Particularly for Washington correspondents or international correspondents, because there's probably not a lot of people for your organizations to lean on to get help. I know one thing that I thought was great that the Times did with its international correspondents was rotate them out to other assignments and rotate people temporarily into their assignments to get more experience. So the idea, like, so you may not be able to influence it, but you may be able to come up with creative ideas to get what you need. Does that make sense? Okay. And by the way, I also think, and it would be interesting to see what you guys think. You guys are all young. I think the power imbalance has actually become worse as newsrooms become flatter and the reporters get closer to the people who are higher up in the organization. There's even a greater power imbalance for you guys than there was for us. So I'm definitely sympathetic to that.
Hi, I'm Sarah from The Hill. You talked about all the difficult...
Sarah from The Hill, nice jacket.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. You talked about all the difficulties that the industry is facing right now, but you also said that you're optimistic. Mm-hmm. Could you tell us why?
Well, I see your work. So there's that part of it, right? Like I use you all to, I'm looking at Washington Post, Axios, Bloomberg. I use you all to make sense of the world and it's super helpful. I still think there are tons of people who are passionate about the profession. I think there is, an enormous need for it. I think this is my own view, if you go back to 2016 today, some of the journalism, just take like what Politico just did on the Supreme Court, right? Some of the journalism that we're seeing today, I think, is even better than the journalism that we were seeing a decade ago. My worry is less about like how long is it sustainable than the quality of work. A lot of my contemporaries would tell you that, you know, back in the olden days, we were much better. No, I see better journalism. I see better journalism today, but I see journalists under much greater pressure. So, you know, if you guys were actually superheroes and superhuman and, you know, only kryptonite took you out, I would be like, keep on going. Because you are doing really amazing work. If you think of some of the work that's been done by, you know, we now have the nonprofit organizations. We now have things like podcasts, like Bone Valley, which did the Leo Schofield case, and that's journalism. We're doing journalism all over, and we're having meaningful impact on the world. I just don't know how sustainable it is. Did I answer your question, or did I just rattle off? Okay.
Hi, Kayla with Bloomberg. Thanks again for coming. I guess I wanted to ask, how did you pick yourself out of the place that you were when you had all that public scrutiny on you and your situation was, you know, exposed? Like, how are you the person that we're seeing here today who's comfortable doing public speaking and things like that?
I did not. I didn't pick myself up. And then my family did, my friends, including some of my colleagues at the Times, you know, the mental health professionals that I saw. I mean, I'm not dismissing the idea that I had to make effort, but I was really blessed by being around an amazing family, a supportive family, supportive friends who, while they were supportive, they also recognized, like, man, what you did was crazy. So, you know, they're not enabling that kind of thinking. And I think all of that, you know, I was blessed by having people who would give me second chances. I think my part in it was really letting go of all my pride and hubris and saying, for what had to be the first time in my bloody life, that my opinion on what to do next doesn't matter. I'm going to listen to you people who love me. And I lost my mom last year. And just the love, the unconditional love, and whether you find it in your family or you find it in your friends or you find it in some other place, it holds you up when you're rebuilding and when you're trying to fix something. So.
Right over here. Let me grab that for you. Thanks. Mike.
Hi, my name is Mike with the AP. I am sorry about your mom. I lost my dad 2 years ago, and work has been hard to, you know, keep going. And it sneaks up on you. So
Yep.
I'm trying to find that balance myself with my professional life and my own pain. So I feel deeply for you.
I hope you find peace in your grief.
Thank you. And it's interesting that we're talking about all this, because that's, you know, something that lives with me and I carry every day, and I will for the rest of my life. And
I didn't understand. I used to think it was about getting over your grief, but it's really about finding peace in it, because it does change your life. And,
absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. And, you know, to that point in everything we're talking about, and thank you for sharing with us today, you know, we do talk about mental health and taking care of yourself. You know, we're talking about it here in this industry, and we've definitely all heard it all before, you know, various ways. But I find the struggle personally is advocating for myself. And I think being, you know, greener and things like that make it harder. But I swallow a lot of pills of things that anger me or like frustrate me.
Irritate you.
Instead of being like, hey, this is what's happening, I swallow them and then they turn into a grenade at some point, you know, in your stomach, something like that. So
hopefully
like,
not a grenade that's inside you based on that metaphor.
Right. You know,
Hopefully you
not a
spit
great
it out
metaphor.
as opposed to.
Yeah. So I just wonder, you know, I hear all these things. Oh, I should do this. I should be finding time for myself. I should be doing this or that. But it's like, I don't really advocate for myself sometimes. And I don't know the tools or ways to actually do it. And maybe it's as simple as being like, sit down and write out what you need to succeed for you. And yet I still haven't done it. So, it's like...
Well, a lot of people, it's a matter of finding what works for your personality. That's a big part of it. Question for you is, why do you think you don't advocate for yourself?
That's a great question. It's a really good
What are you afraid of? In that moment, what's the fear?
I think that a part of it is, disappointing the people that I work really hard for, and looking, I think it's a mentality trick of being like, oh, am I failing? If I say, hey, I need this in order to do better for you down the road,
Yeah, and at the same time, it's really hard to expect them to know what you need, so that's part of the challenge.
Right, they can't read your mind.
So in your particular case, the way I would look at it is you want to be really supportive and loyal to the organization that you're in. I would say the most supportive and loyal thing you can do as a journalist, you'll get this, is to tell people the truth, right? Hiding the truth from them. If you're trying to be of service and you want to serve them and it's going to cause you to eventually collapse, I think sometimes the most supportive thing you can do is say, no, I can't. It's counterintuitive, right? It's very counterintuitive. But if you look in those moments where you're swallowing that pill and just imagine what it looks like in 6 months and a year, and think of if you get fulfillment from being supportive and loyal, am I going to be able to do that? Right? And it could be the same thing if you're driven by ambition, right? Are you going to be able to sustain your goals? Are you going to be able to? So I think giving yourself, to your point, the space to think in those moments where you get irritated or you get stressed or you feel like you can't handle something, even if you just have a little journal that you take out and you write down okay, what is the natural conclusion of this if I allow it to go on? And what do I need? And really just sort of sit on that for a while. It doesn't mean that you immediately act on that feeling that you have. I mean, sometimes it does, right? O.J. Simpson shows up in my apartment with a knife. I should probably act, right? But generally, you want to take some time to reflect on it and figure out what you really need. And then really ask yourself things like that when you're thinking about your values or you're thinking about, what motivates you. Motivation theory is the cue. You have the cue, then there's the action, then there's the reward, right? And if the reward is I get to make some accomplishment, or I get to feel supportive and loyal, asking yourself, if you continue on that cycle, are you going to be able to get that reward? Or that benefit, or have that impact, whatever it might be. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It definitely does.
And if you can't give yourself 5 minutes a day to meditate on these things, there's something very wrong with your life and you should stop now.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think about these things, but it's taking the action to be on the other side of it, right? And I'm very fortunate the people that I work for above me are very compassionate, but I don't, for some reason, find the moment to be well, how do I explain or take the time to be hey, this is something I've been thinking about.
So same thing for me, surrounded by compassionate people. The Times is a crazy place in the sense that they will drive you into the ground and ground you up into nothing doing the job. But when you're in need, I'll never forget this colleague. She began to develop symptoms of schizophrenia. And she started to deteriorate, and she basically couldn't function. It took her 6 months to get out a feature story. They gave her a desk, let her sit at it. They picked up the phone and called the best psychiatrist they could find. They bent over backwards to be helpful. So I had that example in front of me, but still wasn't able to or willing to ask for help. So I certainly relate to it. But if I had it over again, I think I would have probably grabbed some of those compassionate people and not necessarily said, hey, I need help out of the gate, but can I get a cup of coffee with you? And just let where I'm feeling and where I'm at come out. And sometimes the other trick, right, is to let them solve the problem for you by just sharing the way that you're feeling.
Right. Yeah. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi, Ashanti Ford. I'm a national correspondent for Gray Television. I love the emphasis that you're putting on mental health and some of the trauma and stressors that we go through as reporters, but I'm wondering if there's another side of it. I wonder if once you get through whatever it is you're going through, maybe you become a more relatable journalist, maybe you become a stronger journalist. Can you speak to that at all?
Yeah, absolutely. I felt that before I even knew I was diagnosed. I remember talking to Greg Winter, who is a reporter at the Times. I don't know what Greg's doing right now, but he also had a psychology background, and I was like moping across the newsroom like late at night. And he ran into me and he was like, "Are you okay?" And I was like, "Yeah, you know, I'm feeling kind of like bummed." I used the word depressed, not knowing what at that moment depression really was. And I was like, "But, you know, these sad moments I feel like make me more empathetic. And then, you know, these other moments have different effects." I certainly think in my own life, people ask me all the time, if you could have it over again, would you make it disappear? And I say to people, if you told me that what I've gained in life in terms of being more compassionate, more loving, more understanding of people, if I was going to lose all that and I was going to go back to the hubristic, I'm going to use this word, kind of psychopath that I was before, I'm not really. But if I was going to go back in retrospect, I'm like, who is that dude? If I were going to go back to that and you told me the only way that I could get those qualities that I have now, I'd do it again. It sucked, but I'd do it again. So I imagine if I were a journalist today, I would be a much more compassionate, much more understanding, much more nuanced person. A much more, like, that experience taught me, very similar to my mom's loss, how to love deeply. And I don't think going through, for me, I'm not saying everyone, please do not take this as a prescription, but I think for me, I had so much pride and so much ambition and so many other things. I needed a big fall to become a better human and a more empathetic. Now I use these things in other parts of my life, but I think sometimes going through tough things does make better journalists. I just think you shouldn't go alone and shouldn't go too far, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
That was a great question.
Hi, I'm Gabby. I'm with the Nevada Independent. So I think, I'm sure other people feel the same. There are days when like you've canceled your, you're trying to have dinner with someone for weeks and you keep canceling because you're working late and you're just like, God, like I could do something else. Like I'm not tied to this career. And I think maybe it's like my pride or having wanted to do this since I was like 8 or 9. I can't really imagine myself doing anything else. And especially I think in DC, I think there's a thought that if you leave journalism, you can't really come back if you want to like keep working in Washington and in politics. So what was it like for you to eventually like build a career post journalism and sort of transition, like who am I if I'm not a journalist type of transition?
I have to say it wasn't particularly intentional. So I tried for like a year to live in New York afterwards, and like being recognized on the street, being in early mental health treatment, like not having family around, I decided to come back to the DC area. So I was diagnosed, I didn't even mention this, I was diagnosed with bipolar, which is one of the sort of like blessings of this entire experience, was getting the diagnosis. And, the treatment, to say it's intense, so bipolar is a highly treatable disease. We just know nothing about it, and we know nothing about what is going to work in any particular person's brain. So I probably went on like 30, 40 meds, including lots of different antipsychotics to figure out what would be effective. Not 30 or 40 at once, I'd be dead. During that whole process, before I had stabilized, I really wanted to find out from other people what their journey was like, what skills they used. So I started a support group for people with bipolar. At the same time, my dear mother started one for loved ones of people with bipolar. And that sort of like, I didn't know, I really didn't think I was ever gonna have a job again, honestly. But that really sort of as that grew, and that was volunteer work, we started doing work with local psychiatric and psychological practices. And one of the things that we would do is we would go to shopping centers on the weekend, and our volunteers would do depression screenings. Then they would have a psychologist in the office in case someone needed to talk to someone. And the guy who ran one of those practices was like, "You would be a really great life coach." And I was like, ha, 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 ha. I was like, "Do you know my background?" And he was like, "Yes, that's why you would be." So anyway, after some time, he convinced me to do it. He gave me a job. I started working with him. And I realized, A, I'm good at this whole people thing. B, that my experience, to your point, my gray news friend, my experience allowed me to, I think, understand people more deeply, be more compassionate. And one of the other things I realized is, and at this time, like, I can go into a lot of settings right now, say I'm Jayson Blair, and people have no idea who I am. They're like, whatever. But at that time, most people knew. I found one really cool thing about having, I can't believe I'm saying this, about a really cool thing about having a giant public scandal is nobody is afraid to tell you their dark secrets. Because they're like, you went through that. So it ended up being something where I felt like I could have a positive impact. And at some point, I, got to the point where I was like, I'd like to take this show on the road, bring some more coaches together to support people in the mental health arena. And then over time, the way we got into the leadership development work is actually the USDA called us and was like, we had this high potential leader we thought was having performance problems. And it ended up actually being a mental health crisis. So we wanted somebody who understood career development and mental health. So like, honestly, everything by me is accident. I have a podcast now that was a total accident. I was getting interviewed by somebody recently, Rosemary Armeo, who her sister Joanne was the Washington Post Metro editor when I was here, and I think Joanne really dislikes me, but Rosemary tolerates me. But she was like, "Oh, why did you?" And I disagree with her on this point. She's like, "Why did you become a journalist again?" I was like, "What are you talking about?" She's like, "You sit around and you interview people on a podcast." I was like, "Okay." But yeah, so everything for me is by accident. I've learned to let go. I had grand plans like you from the point you were 8. For me, it was maybe 15. I had grand plans for everything before. I just let go of that afterwards. I realized how little I control.
I'm Alex from Cox Media Group, and just kind of like shifting the thought process here as we talk about like compassion and like the compassion your coworker showed you. With all your experience now talking as a life coach and, just observing journalism from afar, what are some ways that we can all be like better coworkers? And I'm at a point in my career where I'm not, and I'm in TV, so it's my structure is different than a lot of people's newsrooms, but I'm overseeing a lot of stories, and I'm editing them. And sometimes I think this looks right to me and I can double, triple check things, but what are the little things that I'm not even thinking to triple check? So, like what are some of the signs of the concern? Maybe like something, if a coworker had said something to you early on in your slippery slope that maybe would have, triggered you to.
Or maybe if I had said something to a coworker.
Yeah, well, I'm just saying, like, sometimes people won't, like, as we've all talked about, people don't feel that they can speak up. So sometimes you need someone to say something to you. And I'm curious.
That's an interesting point I haven't really thought about, that, like, you have the same problem with your bosses that you have with your peers, right? Like, it's really hard to admit to your peers. As I'm watching it's like Instagram, right? Like you look at Instagram, everybody's got all these pretty pictures and pretty life, and you're like, oh, my friends have these wonderful lives, and I'm totally depressed. I can't talk to them about it. But meanwhile, if you're in my position, I'm like, you're all depressed, right? Because I'm talking to multiple of you. It's a really good question. I don't know if I have a great answer for it. I can tell you what I do now, which isn't really a journalism corollary. So I run my own company, and I think there are about 15 full-time people, and they're maybe like 20 part-time or subcontractors we used to do our work. And along the way, like my trusted friend is my ex-partner who's able to give me feedback on life. And we've known each other since we were 14. So it's a great support, right? But she's not with me during my workday. So she's only getting like the output from me. But I personally found like a trusted colleague who I basically said, was totally vulnerable with and was able to say, hey, this is me. This is what stresses me out. These are the signs I've seen when I'm not okay or that I'm struggling with. Hey, could you look out for them, right? So there's that part. That's like the health and well-being part of it. In terms of like, I think having that has been unbelievably instrumental. And I remember this sort of like in newspapers. I didn't really do this, but a lot of people did this. But like you'd have your editing chain, your story went up through the editing chain, but you might have this friend in the newsroom that you like sent your story to before you ever showed it to your editor. Things like that, like informal systems of support. Like you guys are kind of like, you and your peers are in this boat together. And the people who lead you probably have very little power to like change the environment other than being creative about it. But I think finding ways to support each other, both in terms of the actual work, looking out for signs that somebody is like out of character or outside of their baseline, or they're doing their work in different ways. I think those are the things you can do to be supportive. You're not going to catch all errors. You're not going to catch every moment somebody's falling apart. It's not your responsibility either. But I think those are ways that you can help. And I have no idea whether I got to the answer to your question, but sure. Round two.
I was going to say, Jacob, this may or may not be something you feel comfortable speaking to or sort of in your wheelhouse. So just throwing that out there as a disclaimer. But
you always want to hear that before a question. Go on.
We're talking about, being open and honest and sharing our feelings as a means of being better people and being happier. It's also the case, especially for those of us who cover politics, that like we are told we need to be guarded at all times and sort of very obscure. We're not supposed to share what our thoughts or beliefs or feelings
and you're also
are.
in a culture that's very,
right.
Everything's effing kabuki theater.
And so speaking personally, like I've certainly experienced concerns or just like internal struggles about there's this terrible thing happening in the world and I want to speak out about it. I want my friends and family to know that I care about it, but I need to maintain an era of quote unquote objectivity or whatever that
Do you feel
be.
like you have to maintain that with everyone in your life?
Certainly any sort of like public profile, right? A social media thing or whatever. Yeah. And even, if I'm catching up with high school friends, but it's a public thing and who knows what they're sharing. Like there is a certain,
Do you vote?
I vote, yeah, but I mean, I've had conversations with colleagues about like, should we be registered as independents because your party registration is public record? And so I'm just curious, like, I think there's a lot of intergenerational conversations happening about that. Most, at least in my experience, most other people my age tend to push back against notions of like pure objectivity and whatnot. But the people who believe in that are still mostly the ones who are like in charge and hiring. So I would just love your thoughts on any of that, about how we can balance our need to like be real people, but also maintain this notion of like neutrality.
So totally, I would almost, I guess they're interconnected, but I would parse those two topics, like the debate about objectivity and then you being able to have your own opinions. Of course you have your own opinions, right? Like we talk about diversity, right? Part of the reason why we want diversity, whether it's racial diversity or whether you grew up in the West Virginia mountains and you're white, or you grew up overseas, we want diversity because we want to bring different perspectives to covering the news. And that's how a newsroom collectively, whether I'm on a story or not, or people of different religions, different places, you look at everything through your lens. Like there is no way to get to being purely objective. It doesn't mean that you aren't fair, and it doesn't mean that you aren't truthful or accurate, but look at a feature story, any feature story, comes through the lens of the writer as well, right? So we, back in my day, and I cannot be 1,000% sure of this being universal, but we all had our opinions and we shared them with each other. We shared them with other journalists at times, usually people in our organizations, usually people who weren't gonna repeat it. my experience, and like maybe like the people who are editing you guys have taken a magic eraser to their brains, is my experience is like, I knew what the Jerusalem correspondent thought. I knew what people's opinions and perspectives were. And it was really helpful in some ways, because then you could be a check on people. Like, hey man, you might be tipping over. Or as they would say, and I hate this phrase, but they would say, you might be going native. And that was the idea that you're a foreign correspondent for too long. You're now looking at it through the lens of locals, right? So like, I think being able to be checks on each other. The objectivity debate for me is, again, I think part of it is the language that we use around it. I tend to believe that truth, there can be many different angles to it, many different perspectives to it, but I think ultimately truth is the most important thing in journalism. But we make choices in what we decide to cover. We make choices in the way that we decide to cover. We make choices in the voices that we have to cover. And I think underneath everything in journalism, there are some core existing values, right? Altruism, fairness, right? Democracy for us here in the United States. And I think those values influence things. So I think that the line is really advocacy, right? When people are not seeing the other side or the other perspective. Like, I loved it when I got to go report on the Klan or the Sons of Confederate Veterans, because I could see their perspective, they could see my perspective. It was a great opportunity for growth. Like, I would never suppress their voices, no matter how insane I thought they were, right? So I think that whole idea of like advocating and shutting out other voices is insane. But for the editors that you're talking to, you can point them to the civil rights movement. Look at Hotton Carter, look at Reese Cleghorn, look at Gene Roberts, look at all those guys who, put their own lives at risk to cover civil rights. The choice to cover civil rights, there were plenty of things they could choose to cover. They could choose not to cover it. And I do think that it's a moral, values-based choice. And I think there'll always be morals, values-based choices in journalism. You look at even the Times, its positions on the environment, for example. There is they have, as an institution, certain values that they care about. And I think there's nothing wrong with that. Otherwise, cover everything. Everything that happens. Cover me walking down the hallway, cover what's at the ice cream place over there. Right. You got to make value choices.
If somebody has. I have one.
Okay.
You, at the time you arrived at the Times, the trajectory for young journalists was much different. Usually they came through regional publications. We spoke about it a little bit outside. When you arrived at the Times, what was that atmosphere like? A lot of the folks here are arriving at their organizations at much younger than many of us arrived in Washington. How did you?
Yeah, like honestly, if I had grabbed every Washington correspondent at a time when all the regional newspapers had Washington correspondents, I could not find a group of this number of young people. I would have found like 3 or 4.
I guess that's what I'm asking. What kind of support did you find there, and was it? Did you find it difficult? And how much of that difficulty do you attribute to what happened to you?
Yeah, I think there's an element to like lack of maturity on my part, and that the support system wasn't as built for people who are as young as me. And I think what Kevin's getting at is this idea that at the Times or at the Washington Post during that time, or any of the big papers, then you would have probably put USA Today, Chicago Tribune, a bunch of other places. Each of them probably had young reporters, but the traditional path would be to go work for some regional newspapers, Same thing in television, which is still sort of true in television for the most part if you're on air. Go work in some regional markets, cut your teeth there, make all your bloody mistakes there, screw everything up, work really hard covering lots of different topics, then do something impressive and make your way into the next tier of regional newspapers or the next market in television. So I think people were coming in a lot more mature. One of the things that was very nice then, there was a system, both for those of us who were younger, but also those people who were coming in their mid to late 30s, there was a system of apprenticeship too, right? You would go in, you would work on the Metro desk, the more senior Metro desk reporters would like look out for you and help you along the way. You'd eventually graduate to, or graduate's the wrong word, you may go on to something else. And there were those, like the deans of the foreign correspondents would carry along and help the other ones. I don't see you guys having that today. The apprenticeship, the building your craft. Like you're expected to come out with like a built craft. That's why every time people say journalists today, I'm like, please. They did not have what we had. I have two friends who are journalism professors. And they're like, journalists today. I'm like, shut up. I'm like, we had so many opportunities that they don't have before, our bylines were on the front of things. So that's what the environment was like. I don't think it was perfectly built for people who were as young as I was. And so I think that became a bit of a challenge. Kind of bridging that gap. But I would say, comparing it today, there were much more sort of, I want to say formal supports. Like, for example, we didn't have formal mentors, but like you could tell in the background, they were telling people, like, look out and mentor this person. So I think it's going to have to be for you guys establishing those relationships. Whether they're at your publication or they're at some other publication, there are lots of people who are probably like Kevin, probably like Ann, who will bend over backwards to help young journalists. It's just a matter of finding who they are, not overloading them with all of you.
Well, the hour went quickly.
Are we done?
I thank you very much, Jayson, for your candor and your information. Very, very helpful. Thank you so much.
Thanks for the great questions. No, let me clap for you guys.